Morning, everybody. Hello to those of you who are here with us in the auditorium and to those online. Welcome to the Victoria Forum 2024, Building Trust for a Shared Future. Thank you. I'm going to begin with something that is a little bit more than a conventional land acknowledgement. I brought with me in this beautiful case an eagle feather that was given to me by my friend and brother Paul Lacerte of the Raven Group, who was here yesterday but isn't with us today. And I was honored to receive this at a public ceremony in Ottawa around the Moosehide campaign. And in giving it to me, Paul said, "The eagle is what connects us here on this earthly plane with the Creator, the heavens, those above us in the cosmological sense." And so it's to be held by the speaker in order to orient and center that speaker on those things that matter most, and to inform and guide those words in a spirit of reconciliation, of sharing of wisdom, and of convening conversations around the deeper issues and matters that connect us and on which we're focused. So the eagle feather is here. And to move ahead, to move into the land acknowledgement, while we do acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanic nations whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day, these days, for many Indigenous and non-Indigenous speakers, land acknowledgements can seem perfunctory, instead of being expressions of deepening gratitude, relationship, and respect, situating us in place and in history as we gather to work together. And so with your permission, we're going to expand the space for today's land acknowledgement. The Indigenous notion of a 7-generation timeline extends not only towards the future, but also to the past. And so I would like you to invite your ancestors to join you here today in helping to shape your reflections and understanding and appreciation for where we are right now in this moment. And if you want to invite your ancestors to take up a place here, we've got room for them, lots of room over there on that side of the stage. And you may not know beyond 2 or 3 generations back who those ancestors were, but they helped make you who you are, and their lives involved wise stewardship, struggle, and sacrifice that enable us to be here today. So we want to honor and thank them for thinking of us and living in ways that provided for our well-being. Next, please consider your children, if you have been so blessed, grandchildren, and coming generations, and invite them to join us too. I think there's room on this side to have those children, future children, join us. And we welcome their presence, the ancestors, the children, as we gather on these lands to discuss, plan, reflect upon our collective way forward. And to thank them for coming, we will use a word common to all 3 nations, the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Wasanic, and that word is Haishka. So if you wouldn't mind saying after me, Haishka. And you can hold up your hands, and I'd like to hear it a little bit more energetically. Haishka. Excellent. We want to make sure that those spirit presences hear us. And so thank you, honored ones. Haishka Seam. Haishka Seam. Excellent. So before finishing with our thank yous, I'd like to express one more, and for you to take this up with me as well. To the people at home who are caring for children, an elderly relative, looking after the farm and the animals, the office, the home, whoever and whatever needs taking care of so that you could be here today. Those people who are not here but enable us to be here, Haishka Seam to them too. Now, last night, Saul thanked each of our forum sponsors and program partners, and so I will not go through that list again. I think we'll see a slide with those names up here shortly. For now, I want to note that it includes organizations from the public, private, philanthropic, community, and academic sectors. We have a government body, an Indigenous innovation organization, a couple of global corporations, a community foundation, an academic institute, and so on and so on. The point being that the issues that we're here to discuss reflect and act upon impact all of us. They implicate all of us, no matter which sector we belong to, and that it is going to take a collective effort to navigate our way forward. So let me speak now as the director of the Regenerative Economy program of the Victoria Forum. It may not need to be said, but one of the challenges with this kind of work is to listen past our preconceptions about what other sectors are like, about how they work. It can be frustrating for people in the business sector to work with community organizations who seem to have an unlimited amount of time to sit around tables and talk things through and so on. It can be alarming for people in the community sectors to see those corporate leaders and participants so insistent, let's get this done, let's get moving, we don't have a lot of time here. Those kinds of tensions exist between each of these sectors, and they're important to see through and beyond in order to have the kind of space, shared space, and decision-making inclusive. So, and if I could add one more piece of advice, that is to be conscious of your own use of jargon and ways of engaging in insider talk in your sector as you engage with people from other parts of this continuum, this quadrant. So you can see in the original design of the Regenerative Economy program in your forum agenda that we set out to establish sessions around affordable non-market housing, Indigenous economic reconciliation, planetary health and well-being, the generational scale of ownership transfer in the SME sector, and accelerated regional decarbonization. And reflecting on the fact that we live on the edge of 3 oceans, the blue economy theme, which integrates conservation with the needs of coastal communities and our larger economy, and a global sharing of resources and governance responsibilities. So if these are the what of the program, we've also included several explorations of the how. How do we improve our capacity for cross-sectoral collaboration? How do we bring this conversation to communities and involve them in making decisions that ensure their needs are being addressed while contributing to the larger good? Complementing these, we've added an overarching theme around the emerging field of system and finance. You're going to hear more about this, but our concern, our obligation, our objective here is to ensure that resources necessary for successful transition are positioned to enable to achieve that. This implies significance that I came from, the philanthropic sector, where we are now thinking about granting that enables impact investing and that creates such things as loan guarantees, pooled products for financing larger initiatives at scale. So we're essentially moving from individual initiatives, robots, to collective shared responsibility for investing in a successful transition. And this applies not only to philanthropy, of course, but to our mainstream financial sector. And we see the potential for leadership coming from family offices, from high net worth individuals, foundations, of course, governments as well. And that is an emerging theme at this session. There are working groups. There's a working group now you'll hear from that is going to invite you to participate in a systems mapping exercise that will inform this work going forward from the forum. So let me just say that conclude this part of my remarks, or conclude these remarks by saying that if an economy is the product of relationships among people and between people and the planet, where do we need capital to flow to enable a regenerative transformation? I leave you with that question. And of course, absent some dictatorial overlord, we cannot proceed along this path without building trust for a shared future. It's my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, who is Dan Leclerc. Dan is the CEO of the Global Business School Network, a Victoria Forum partner. And just to quickly say that prior to holding this position, Dan held a variety of positions, including Chief Knowledge Officer with the AACSB, an association and accrediting organization for over 1,600 business schools in 100+ countries. He's been recognized for his pioneering efforts in the creation of the UN Principles of Responsible Management Education, or PRME, and he's participates in several industry-level think tanks and change efforts, including the Aspen Institute's Business and Society program. Alors, s'il vous plaît, rejoignez-moi pour souhaiter un bienvenue à Dan sur notre scène pour annoncer le gagnant de concours aux vidéos étudiants. Please welcome Dan Leclerc, who will announce the winner of the student video competition.
Good morning. Good morning. Hey, listen, bear with me just before we get started. I want to ask you to do something simple. I want you to imagine a place of incredible natural beauty, whether it be mountains and trees. For me, it's water, right? It's rivers, it's lakes, it's seas, wildlife, birds, fish, bears, if you want. But also a community of people living at one in harmony with nature. Imagine this place. Just bear with me for a little while and put it on hold. Just hold it as I go through this brief introduction for just a little while. I'm Dan Leclerc. I'm working at the Global Business School Network, which is leading business schools, about 150 of them now, working together to strengthen the contributions of business education to inclusive and sustainable development. Anyone interested in learning more about that, of course, I'd be happy to share with you. It's schools like, in the US, MIT Sloan, and in the UK, I met several people from Oxford Said, and in France, it's INSEAD, and China, it's the China European International Business School. But in the Global South, it's Lagos Business School, University of Cape Town. It's from Fundação Dom Cabral in Sao Paulo. So it's from the Global North and the Global South working together to accelerate development, especially development that's inclusive and sustainable. Now, we're thrilled to partner with the Victoria Forum and to support it. The one objective that we have is simple. It's to amplify the voice of students in this dialogue. That's it, to amplify the voice. 2 years ago, we were here. We ran an essay contest, and the topic was bridging divides, if you were here. This year, it's a video contest, and the topic, as you know, is rebuilding trust. So we invited students from all over the world to submit videos. They had to be 3 minutes or less. And we told them that we would judge the videos on 5 things: problem framing, relevance to the theme, storytelling, potential for impact, and creativity. We had a set of preliminary judges who narrowed the set down to 5, and a group of finalist judges who selected a winner. Now, you could view all 5 videos in the lobby. They're on a continuous loop, and we encourage you to take a look at all 5 videos. But for now, I want to highlight one, just one video. I want to share it with you. And to do that, I want to take you back to that place you imagined a little bit earlier. And what if I told you that place has a dark and disruptive past? What if I told you that irresponsible business exploited the land? What if I told you that a series of government decisions alienated the people? What if I told you that the people were victims of conflict? Conflict that they didn't cause? What would you think? What would you do? Well, Johari Azizi Perez Duran, a student at the University de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, decided to go there to her place and learn more. Before I start, I want to tell you, we asked the students to submit in their own language if they wish, but they had to use English subtitles. So if you understand Spanish, great. If you don't, put on your spectacles and read along with us.
Nosotros confiamos en el suelo que pisamos, el agua que bebemos y hasta el aire que respiramos. Pero si nos cambian el suelo, agua y aire, te preguntaría, ¿confías en lo que tienes o en lo que eres? Para responder esta pregunta nos dirigimos a un lugar mágico llamado Sistema Delta Estuarino del río Magdalena, Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta. Este humedal colombiano está designado al convenio Ramsar y reconocido como una reserva de la biosfera por la UNESCO. Está conformado por más de 20 lagunas, en donde habitan más de 200 tipos de aves, algunas endémicas y otras migratorias, en gran medida procedentes de Norteamérica, con una gran diversidad de manglares y arrecifes de coral. Desde mediados del siglo XIX se fueron creando viviendas para pescadores, hoy llamados pueblos palafitos, quienes han desarrollado una cultura anfibia debido a la mezcla de la vida en el agua. Dentro de este humedal se encuentra un pueblo llamado Nueva Venecia, en el cual el 22 de noviembre del año 2000 se produjo uno de los hechos de violencia con mayor trascendencia perpetrados por un frente paramilitar, causando injustificadamente crímenes de lesa humanidad con homicidios múltiples y desaparición forzada, culminando con la masacre de 40 personas muertas y 3.000 personas desplazadas. Para poder sentir un poco este conflicto tomé uno de sus botes, el cual fue el sistema de transporte utilizado por mujeres viudas y niños al momento de la masacre. Inicialmente sentí miedo de caer al agua, luego cansancio y finalmente angustia por llegar a mi destino. Fue entonces en este momento cuando entendí que la confianza no es ausencia de miedo, sino la esperanza de lo que podemos conseguir. Hemos observado cómo las instituciones han jugado un papel fundamental para el fortalecimiento de esta comunidad, como lo son el Estado colombiano, el respaldo de policías y militares, así como de entidades sin ánimo de lucro, universidades, fundaciones, entre otros, quienes por medio de investigaciones e inversiones han hecho de este humedal y de los pueblos palafitos un mejor lugar. Estas aguas, que aunque hoy no tienen sangre, fue el escenario de dolor para muchas familias y un ejemplo de superación que, confiando en el trabajo de todas estas instituciones, poco a poco han ido retornando a este lugar. Sabemos que hay mucho por hacer y por mejorar. Creemos en un futuro lleno de esperanza y prosperidad. Colombia es un país de inmensa riqueza cultural, con un espíritu indomable, lleno de lugares mágicos y sorprendentes, donde trabajamos por superar las marcas de la violencia y el conflicto. Y es que así como las aves migratorias llegan a cada lugar sin conocer los desafíos a los cuales se van a encontrar, es así como esperamos que todos nosotros vivamos en un mundo donde podamos disfrutar de manera sostenible todas estas maravillas ecológicas y culturales. Trabajemos en su conservación, pero sobre todo en la dignificación de las víctimas, no para borrar su memoria, sino para enseñarle al mundo lo que no puede volver a ocurrir. Confío que los buenos somos más. ¿Y tú? ¿En qué confías?
You may have noticed me off to the side using my phone, my camera, taking a picture of you, but more importantly, I knew that I wanted to repeat back to you a line from the video, and I'd forgotten to write it down, so I took a picture. There's a place where she said, "I realize trust is not the absence of fear, but the hope for what we can achieve." And I think that means all the difference for the work that we're doing here and the work we'll do after. Congratulations to Johari Azizi Perez Duran, the University de los Andes, and to the Victoria Forum and all the students that submitted videos for this experience. Thank you all.
Yes, Dan. Thank you, Dan, and welcome to the paddle. You would have recognized this last night at the Songhees Wellness Center. This paddle was commissioned to accompany and inspire the process of reconciliation through sport, and we welcome it here on stage. Alors, pour continuer, c'est mon plaisir d'introduire Andrew Parkin, directeur PDG de Institute Environics for Survey Research, Executive Director of the Environics Institute, a not-for-profit agency created in 2006 to conduct in-depth public opinion on and social research on the issues shaping Canada's future. Prior to joining the Institute, Andrew was the director of the Mowat Centre and associate professor at the Monk School of Affairs and Public Policy, and he has convened, informed, and led national and international discussions on a wide range of public policy issues, acting as a public spokesperson on education, federalism, and the Canadian political community. Accompanying Dan and entering into a conversation with him, we have Senator Donna Dasko, who is a senator from Ontario with a professional background in public opinion research and so on. So please welcome Dr. Andrew Parkin and Senator Donna Dasko.
Good morning, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be here today to participate in the Victoria Forum, and I'm very pleased to be here with my colleague Andrew Parkin, where we will continue the conversation about trust. Now, last night, we heard that trust was vitally important for society and for our institutions. And we understand from our discussion last night that human relations at our institutions must be built on trust. But we did hear different perspectives about whether trust may have declined. We heard that trust may have been greater in the past. On the other hand, we heard a different perspective as well, that in fact our history has been characterized by mistrust. And in fact, we are moving to a better way of thinking about our institutions through reconciliation and even multiculturalism. So the trend is not entirely clear from our discussion last night. And today what we are doing is we are looking at public trust and confidence in institutions. You've just heard about a brief introduction to my colleague Andrew Parkin. I have had a career in the research business, and I have known Andrew now for at least 25 years. When one of my clients was an organization called the Council for Canadian Unity, and Andrew was a senior researcher at the council, and I met him then, and I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with Andrew over many years on many different projects. So our plan today is as follows. We're going to touch on a number of topics. We're actually going to look at data, line graphs, bar graphs. I love this stuff. We're going to look at some data. We're going to take a broad brush approach. We're going to look at some
data. Canada in terms of trust in institutions. We're going to look at briefly at some American data from the
Pew organization and some OECD data from the OECD organization, which surveys member countries on a periodic basis on the topic of trust. After we look at the slides, which Andrew is going to present, Andrew and I will have a brief fireside chat right here and just try to unpack some of the trends and touch on some key points. So that will be our contribution today. In terms of questions, I think we would take questions not as part of the session, but after in the foyer and so on as we have coffee. So, Andrew, I know you're here. There you are. Couldn't do this without you. Where are you? Okay. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Donna, and good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. So I am the person with the line and bar graphs, and I'm going to walk through them. I'm going to walk through a lot of information fairly quickly. So I'm going to start with two of the least surprising slides that anyone will see today. just to set the background. So in terms of what is the context in which we're having this conversation about trust in Canada right now, the context is the Canadian public is increasingly dissatisfied with the way the country is going. So as you can see here, for a long period of time, we had a kind of 60-40 ratio. 60% of the public was generally satisfied with how we were doing, 40% less satisfied. It became 50-50. The pandemic bumped it back up a bit, went down to 50-50, but now we flipped, right? So now 60% of Canadians are not satisfied with the way the country is going. And so the inverse of where we are before. So the public mood is not excessively positive, and a lot of that is linked to the economy. So there's also been a reversal to how we feel about how the economy is going in the country. There used to be more Canadians who thought the economy was getting better compared to the proportion who thought it was getting worse. Again, that's flipped. There's a distribution of views there, but you can see the proportion of Canadians who think the economy is doing badly has doubled over the last few years. So that's the backdrop, and that shows up when we ask Canadians then about how they feel their governments are doing. So this is not a question about whether you trust governments in general. This is a very particular question about whether Canadians trust the federal government more to address certain problems, trust the provincial government more. So it's a trade-off question about how we manage things in the federation. So we're asked, do you like the federal government more on a particular issue, the provincial government more, both of them equally, or none of them? And what I'm showing you here is the answer for none, right? Those Canadians who say, I don't trust either the federal or the provincial government to manage healthcare, to address climate change, to manage the economy, to manage the immigration system. So essentially, more of this theme of dissatisfaction with how the country is doing and how governments are performing. Okay? So that's what's been going on the last few years. That's the backdrop to our discussion of trust in public institutions. So now I'll take you through particular results when we ask, to what extent do you trust a number of the following? Now, this is an awful slide. No one should be allowed to show slides with this much information jumbled up in the middle of it, but it's okay. I'm going to kind of unpack it as we go through. With this one, before I get to some others, I just want to make a couple of very general observations that we'll keep coming back to, right? So the first one is there's quite a range depending on what you ask about, right? So at the top, if you ask about our electoral system, our court system, a system of justice, you'll get higher levels of trust than at the bottom if you're asking about those elements more directly involved in the day-to-day political system, particularly political leaders, political parties, and so on, are at the bottom of the distribution of how we feel about different institutions. So that's one observation.
The other one is you may remark that the level, this is just showing the proportion that has a strong level of trust or a high level of trust.
So you get to political parties, they're 15%. That seems pretty low, right? So we'll come back to that. Low levels of trust in political actors. The other observation I just want to make generally here is it's very kind of hard to see on this chart, but it's hard to find a really strong overall trend. There's certainly not an overall declining trend. If you look really carefully, you can see a little bit of a positive bump in 2021. So in 2021, when this survey was taking place, was before Omicron, but after vaccines, right? So things were a little bit more positive there, have kind of settled back down. But overall, the numbers on the most recent numbers are all actually higher than the numbers we've started this particular trend with. So let me add a little bit of more detail and nuance to that, and we'll just stick with one of these elements. So the proportion of Canadians who say they have trust in Parliament. And this is on a 7-point scale. You can say 1 very low, 7 very high, 4 is the middle point, and you can place yourself anywhere along that scale. So this is the number that was on the previous graph. Okay, this is the proportion of Canadians who say they have a lot of trust in Parliament. As I said at the time, not a lot, right? 26%. I will observe that's actually twice as high as what it was in 2010, so we'll just kind of make that observation in passing, but it still seems pretty low. I don't have time to go through all of the international data. I'll get to some in a moment, but one of the things I would say is some of the countries where there's really strong trust in government are authoritarian countries, right? They're not democracies like ours. Now, this is only one way to measure this, right? This is 6 and 7 on that scale. If you add another point in that scale, so everyone who is on the positive side of the midpoint, right, 5 to 7, you get about half of Canadians have that much trust in Parliament. And if you add another point, you take everyone who's not on the low side, everyone who's from the midpoint up, you get to almost 3/4 in some cases, or 7 out of 10 Canadians who have positive trust or some trust in Parliament. So which is the right measure? And how much trust is enough trust in a democracy? So those are questions I'm just going to leave hanging for now, but what I sort of want to emphasize is there's different ways to sort of count this, and you can decide where you think the line should be drawn about how much trust we need in our system. But now let me just go back to the general pattern, and this is the same data I showed you on the line graph, but it's a little bit easier on the bar graph. So we can see those observations I made before. Trust in elections, trust in the Supreme Court is higher than trust in political parties. For most of these trusts over the last decade or last 15 years has edged a little bit upwards, a little bit of a bump in 2021, as I mentioned, in that phase of the pandemic. One institution that maybe where trust has eroded a little bit more is the police, and I think we can all come up with the reasons why that might be the case. But this is the overall trend, and again, I'm just showing strong trust. The other point that I want to make is when we talk about strong trust, and this gets back to what I was just saying a moment ago, what's the right measure? So very few, if you just go back here, political parties, Parliament, again, very few Canadians would have strong trust or a high degree of trust in those political institutions. But at the same time, very few Canadians have very low trust. Right? So in a typically Canadian fashion, we're mostly in the middle. Right? So most Canadians have a little, some, middling, somewhat trust. Okay? Let me leave that aside, and now I've got some other questions to show around confidence in leaders. And I feel comfortable switching from the word trust to the word confidence because in French it's the same word. So I'm going to stand on that ground and say that despite the change in wording of the question, we're really talking about the same type of thing. So this is a question, an agree-disagree question about whether you have confidence in different types of leaders in our society. The selection of leaders here is very different from in the previous questions, but the general kind of pattern is the same. The further you get away from the day-to-day interactions of politics, the more confidence people have. And then at the bottom of the list, when you get to the direct part of politics, political leaders, that's where we have the least confidence, but we have the most confidence in scientists, a little bit more in leaders of environmental groups and Indigenous leaders than we would in business leaders or political leaders. But I think the key thing, again, that we want to know is what's the trend, right? So is confidence growing? Is it declining? And now I want to emphasize that answering that question depends on two things: when you start measuring and how many surveys you do. Right? So it's quite easy, if you want to tell the story of declining trust in government in this case, right? If I pick these 3 years starting in 1995, getting to our most recent survey in 2023, it's pretty clear that confidence in governments has declined. But if I start instead in 1987 and pick a different series of surveys, it kind of looks pretty stable, right? That nothing much has changed. If I start in 1992 and pick 3 years from that, confidence in governments is increasing. This is quite easy to do, right? Because, of course, the answer is it goes up and down. Now, I had a very awkward moment in the drive over yesterday to dinner, or to the reception with the Right Honourable Joe Clark, because he made the mistake of asking me, when was confidence in government's lowest in Canada? And I didn't want to answer the question. But nonetheless, as you see, so if I was doing this presentation in 1987, I would be doing a presentation on declining confidence in government. If I was doing this presentation in 2006, I would be trying to explain why we had increasing confidence in government. So there's ups and downs, and that's why I showed those slides at the beginning, right? Because a lot of that is tied to the economic cycle. But the other thing that we'll point out here right away is there's one thing that does seem to have kind of reset recently, and that's confidence in business leaders. So that one is not going up and down. It held pretty steady. But then it declined after the financial crisis and it never recovered. I'll just sort of emphasize that here. So picking these years, and again, this series is starting at 2006, a high point. So you see less of an up and down and more of a just kind of general decline for everything here, business leaders, governments, political leaders. But the fall in confidence is actually sharper for business leaders. So I just wanted to put that on the table because we're here talking about,
I think, mostly about trust in public institutions.
But let's not narrow that conversation too much because that's an important part of what's going on. And then just a couple of quick additional points that I make. I'm trying not to get too political, but if you break these questions down by how people would vote in elections, so by party support, I want to kind of emphasize two things that, trust not only goes up and down in general according to, either the economic or the political cycle, but of course it goes up and down for different groups. Right, so if you look at confidence in governments in the middle, shockingly, right, people who vote liberal are more likely to have confidence in governments when the liberals are in power. But conservatives had just as much confidence in government when the conservatives were in power. So there's a lot of seesawing going on underneath those averages. But the other point I wanted to make is just how big that drop in confidence in government is, confidence in business leaders is for conservative party supporters. Right now, it's gone down for everyone on the left there, but you can see quite a sharp drop. And I just make a comment that if you wanted to have a whole different session on what's the difference between the Conservative Party today and the Conservative Party of the 1980s, I think you would have to bring this, not so much the change in confidence in government, but the change in confidence in business into that conversation. Okay, quickly on the international context, wish we had we could spend a lot of time on different types of studies that have been done, but I just want to hit some key themes. And I think we'll come back to this in the conversation, but that's a long tracking of American public opinion on whether government can be trusted to do the right thing. And it looks pretty clear that there's been a significant decline over time.
If you Google, declining trust, declining trust, headlines like a global trust crisis. Quite easy to find, number of editorials and so on. So let's just park that and just I thought we had okay. In my slide, I had
park that Canada, so it was a little easier to find. This is the OECD study that Donna mentioned that came out recently, just scoring a number of different countries. So obviously. It's pretty striking that there is a significant range, a significant variation. Canada, then, if you can spot us, are fourth from the top, so the fourth most likely to have some degree of trust in national government. So I think the point I'm trying to make in this slide is we don't stick out, or if we do stick out, it's more positive than negative in terms of where we rank with the number of other kind of Western industrialized countries. That's the same if you look at trust in the media. So I think we're fifth from the top. Then again, a huge range. If you read English language media these days, you're going to read a lot about what's going on in the United Kingdom, which is here noted as Great Britain, right at the end, right, with the least amount of trust in the media. But the point is that that's their story, right? It's not necessarily everyone's story at the moment. This is a lot of words, but a great study because this is a study of trends in trust in democracy, trust in institutions across Europe. And it's quite easy to summarize because essentially what the author here, Larry Bartels, is saying is what I showed in that slide with all the ups and downs, right? That if you look over a long period of time at a number of different measures across a number of different countries in Europe, you will find no single clear trend. You will find that things cycle up and down, very much tied to the economic conditions in each country. You will find a great deal of variation. You will find that the more you talk about the electoral or the justice system, the higher the trust is, and the more you talk about political leaders, the lower the trust is. So very much the same patterns we talked about before. Let me just finish up now with one final point, and it's a point about, again, trying to broaden the conversation. Because it's natural that we want to talk about trust in government, trust in political parties, trust in political leaders. But I think what I would probably argue is that if we want to talk about what makes a democracy work, it's probably more important to talk about the trust that we might have in our neighbors. And and another question where we ask about that very directly, very few Canadians have low trust in their neighbors. It's about 10%. So most Canadians have some degree of trust in people that they don't necessarily even know. And you can see that here. This is a 5-point scale, and I broke it out because I think, again, you can see that we tend to cluster around the middle. But very few Canadians have low trust in the people they work with. Very few Canadians have low trust in people who are different from them ethnically. There's some of us who have low trust in people who disagree with us politically, but relatively few, right? If we want to sort of say, well, where do we get to areas of low trust? It's to complete strangers, and then, of course, once we get back to politics. But the final point to make about this, and I could have started with this slide because to a certain extent, I mean, I'll end with it, but I think it's the whole story, is all of that varies by people's well-being, right? By their economic well-being, by their health. So this is essentially showing how all of those measures I showed, the trust you have in the people you work with, people who are different from you, will be higher for people who are well off economically, and decline as people get less economically secure. And I could show this same chart over and over again with different measures. So if I did this by mental health, it would look exactly the same. If I did it by life satisfaction, it would look exactly the same. If I did it by experiences of discrimination, it would look exactly the same, right? So the question about, how much do we trust our institutions is probably not as good a question as who trusts them and why, and who doesn't and why, and how social exclusion, I think, plays into that conversation about trust. So I've reached the end of the initial presentation. And so just as we're getting ready for a conversation, I guess I can kind of recap what I'm saying. I think the theme of the conference is excellent, right? Building trust. The theme of the session that we were given was declining trust, which is a great question too as well. But I would kind of still reframe that a little bit because it's not clear that that's the main trend that's going on. It's obviously going down at some times for some institutions and so on. But, as trust declines for some people, it increases among other people in our society. I mean, none of those graphs
So I showed at the beginning, I could show for Alberta and Quebec. And those lines crisscross. The last 10 years, trust has steadily declined in Alberta.
10 years, trust.
But it's steadily increased in Quebec, right?
So it goes up and down depending on what's going on in your society at the time. And what's going on in the economic and political cycle matters. But I think low trust may be a bigger issue than declining trust, but then low trust new. I mean, we had low trust in political leaders for as long as we've been asking these questions. And then you could also ask the question, how much should citizens trust their leaders in a democracy? And then I'll just end by emphasizing again that last question on the sort of who has trust and who is losing trust and why, I think really matters. Thank you.
Here I am. There's so much to unpack, and we only have about, yeah, okay, we only have a few minutes to try to unpack it a little bit more. So, so first of all, when we talk about trend lines, especially when we talk about Canada, we are talking about a very mixed timeline, very mixed the trend line, I guess the word is, very mixed trend line in terms of confidence and in terms of trust in all of our institutions. And I think you showed that with the way you presented the data and for different institutions and so on. But it is true that we have seen, I want to just talk about the topic of decline for a second. Confidence went up during COVID, and now it's fallen for each of those. So I think that's part of the trend line that I see, and I hope you'd agree that you see this in the data as well. And whether you think it's a consequence,
Well, no, I think it is. I mean, I think there's maybe two ways to tell the story, and one is that immediate term, that if we go back 2 years, most of these indicators are lower or worse than they were. as I mentioned, at that particular time in the pandemic, despite the misery that everyone was living through, and despite the obvious division of opinion in our society about it, nonetheless, the most Canadians felt that their system was generally responsive through things like CERB and the vaccine program and so on at that time. What we didn't expect, I think most people thought, well, the pandemic's going to be really awful, and then everything's going to get better. And what we didn't expect is to come out of the pandemic to deal with the cost of living and interest rate crisis and so on. So in emphasizing that things are falling now as that economic mood of the country changes is not to say it doesn't matter, right? Or to kind of wave it away. But it is to sort of explain it. I mean, it really can follow if you follow the graph on trust, you're following the economic cycle. It is to put it into context, but it's not to minimize it. I mean, if Canadians right now don't feel that the system is responsive to their needs on housing or other things like that, that is a problem. It's just not unprecedented,
Right.
or without explanation.
Understood. Also, in terms of trend lines, a couple of things stand out for me. So one of them, and your comments on the slide in terms of OECD countries, what we see there is the trends. So clearly, again, just like in Canada, there's no actually clear trend line. And what also strikes me is the vast difference among countries in levels of trust. So we have huge levels of trust in some countries, and then that goes all the way down to the bottom with very low levels of trust in others. So what this says to me is that there is no easy way for us to understand trust. If we are interested in the phenomenon of trust, we actually have to study and look at those countries to understand what they're going through, what the challenges, economic and political challenges are. And that is how we explain trust in the end, is it not? It would be nice if there was a big sweeping trend and we could say, oh yes, there's this massive decline in trust around the world, and isn't that important? But in fact, we have to do the work to study the countries to actually understand what's going on there. So
Yeah.
That's one thing I would conclude from this data.
No, I think so. And again, I think to a certain extent we're shaped, well, maybe speaking personally, I'm not that multilingual, so we're shaped a bit by the Anglosphere context, right? And as I mentioned, the UK is just in an awful situation. And for people who follow UK politics, you can go back to various kind of crises or gates, Partygate and the expense scandal that goes back. I mean, there's reasons why the UK is at the bottom of the list. For the United States, we didn't have time to go through all the ups and downs on that slide, but while there's been a decline since 1960, in that slide I showed, it's actually been relatively stable since Obama was president. But you can imagine that if you unpacked again Republican-leaning Americans and Democratic-leaning Americans, the average stays the same, but it just crisscrosses in terms of the ups and downs of how people feel when Obama is president and then Trump's president. And, you have completely, I used to trust government, but I don't anymore, right? But then the person next to you says the exact opposite, right? So I'm agreeing with you. I think that individual context of each society matters. And actually, I would even say more, that in Canada, again, to emphasize, if we were having this conversation in Quebec in French, it would be different. Because we would be explaining why levels of support for the Canadian political system in Quebec are at an all-time high.
Right. Just on the point with respect to the U.S., and that data you presented is from the Pew Research Center, a highly respected research center, and they have been collecting this data for decades. To me, that is hugely dramatic to see that decline. And I take your point about, Democrats, Obama, they have trust, and the reverse when the Republicans are in office. But that is a trend line that we can't deny. And I, given that we spoke of that, you talked about the European countries and the OECD, to me, this is almost like American exceptionalism gone bad. They don't trust. That line graph is one of the most dramatic I've seen in terms of declining trust in the U.S. So that's the way I see that data, and I hope you agree.
Well, sure, and I think again, like when I'm talking about the ups and downs, again, I'm not trying to say we shouldn't be concerned with low trust, or I'm just again trying to roll the tape back a little bit. But in that American context, I think the pushback to some of what I said is, well, what happens if it goes up and down, and then it goes down and it never goes back up, right? Which is, I think what we see the tail of that graph. So
We're not seeing any sign.
yeah, we're not seeing any signs, and given where the society is at there at the time, there's not any sort of sense that it's going to change overnight. So yeah, and I think you can ask that about our society. Well, what if it's going down now, like as we've talked about since the pandemic, since 2021? What if it gets stuck, right? It doesn't come back up. As a pollster, I have to wait and find out. But the other thing the only counterbalance I would say is that, and I put the graph up again, but most of that change, if you look at that sweeping graph, most of that change was between 1960 and 1980. And that, Martin Luther King being assassinated, and Watergate, and Vietnam, and all that kind of stuff. And that's important, but it's not what we're grappling with. It's a legacy we're living with, right? But just put a lot of things, put what happened to trust, a lot of that we could have had that conversation, in 1982, for instance, and it would be,
right,
they were just as relevant. But yeah, I think maybe the main thing she said is not a very encouraging graph, and what if you do get stuck and you don't end up with an upswing?
Exactly. So those are the trend line things that stand out for me. But moving to the other couple of things that stand out for me, one is the exceptionally low trust that Canadians have in anything that has to do with the political institutions. Not so much government. You made the point about, conservatives and governmentalists and so on. But the point about political parties and political leaders, every one of these data points where you've asked the question shows that they are exceptionally low. And I don't think it matters much how you look at it, but they are always at the bottom of the list. And surely there is something wrong here. Now, we can look at this in different ways. Do they deserve to be so lowly rated by Canadians? That's one way we can look at it. Do they deserve their low ratings? We spoke even last night a little bit about how politics has changed, how negativism seems to have taken over, trashing parties and people and ideas on social media, the fact that people don't seem to treat each other, political people don't seem to treat each other with the respect that they may have in the past. These may be part of what we're looking at. Maybe these are some of the things that Canadians are responding to with respect to the low ratings. So that's a possibility. On the other hand, maybe it's skeptical social values that are there to explain it. And yet, as well, Canadians have higher trust in other institutions, like the courts, like law enforcement, like the way we hold elections. So maybe that's what's really important, is that we have confidence in the institutions that are less political, quote unquote political, and that is where our trust lies, in those institutions. And maybe that is perfectly acceptable. So I've thrown in a whole bunch of things there, and I don't know how you ever respond. But
and maybe political leaders are at the bottom of the list only because we didn't ask about pollsters. But
other professions,
other professions. I mean, I think there's 2 points. To a certain degree, yes. I mean, I think what counts, it counts a little bit more if citizens trust that the outcomes of the political system are going to be legitimate. So elections, legislation, courts. I mean, it's so whole other discussion. But the way Canadians feel about our court system and our Supreme Court is completely different from how Americans feel about their court system and their Supreme Court, for instance, and that's essential and really important. So to a certain degree, I would lean that way. That say, it's unfortunate for political leaders if there's not an upswelling of public support necessarily, but I think in a democracy, the citizens are supposed to be somewhat skeptical. 48% of Americans trust Donald Trump right now, and that's a problem for democracy, right? That's not strengthening American democracy. But the other thing that I think is important, and it was touched on last night, and I think about this a lot, right? Is that experience of extremism, toxicity, in some cases violence, as talked about, as Mr. Manley talked about, the change in how politicians, the amount of security they feel they need. And this is obvious, goes without saying, is a serious problem in disrupting our democracy. But I think I would just want to say is that's why, again, that long view of trust is the same, because the level of trust we have now in political leaders is low, but it was the same. You could find points in the 1980s when it was the same and we weren't having those problems. So all I would say is it's not a cause and effect, right? That we didn't pull the lever on trust and suddenly, I have a local MP who is not running again because she also feels that this is not safe for her family. That didn't happen because we went from X% on trust to Y% on trust. That is happening for other reasons, and we can get it, around social media, around the ability of people on the fringes of politics to mobilize and exert influence, and that's an important conversation. And trust is part of the environment there, but as I said, it's not as trust goes down and toxicity in politics goes up, and so if we can only get trust up by 5 points, everyone will feel safer. Like, I don't think that's the case.
Or
there's a different,
I mean, the reverse, but I think the question is really, should we be viewing this as a problem? Because there are many different ways to think about the low trust we have in political leaders. So the good way to look at it, one good way to look at it, is that we have to be skeptical. People have to be skeptical. So there is a positive element in there as well. And yet, at the same time, it seems sometimes a little too negative when looking at these numbers. And as we all know, politicians know many politicians, and we know that they're very good people. So it's sometimes you look at this and say, well, they don't actually deserve the kind of low ratings that we find. So in any case, I think we'll leave that as a topic to think about, except with the caveat that it is low. I mean, we can't deny it, right? We can't deny it. It's there in the numbers. It's something that we have to think about. Now, I know we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left. So I really appreciate the analysis of social trust, because for us, it takes the analysis of trust to different areas. So we're talking about trusting neighbors. We're talking about trusting people of different backgrounds than we are. And we're talking about maybe social cohesion. And these are important topics that may be becoming more important. And I especially like your analysis of socioeconomic differences and how social trust is related to that. So there's a few things to unpack there. One of the conclusions might be that if a society tackles poverty and deals with socioeconomic inequalities and focuses on education and literacy, maybe trust will improve. Is that kind of?
Well, I think so. I think that's the argument I would make, and I think it's a circle in a way, because I think asking questions around trust, what's going on with trust, different aspects of it, social trust. It can lead us, I think it's a path that leads us to confront that social exclusion. And because then we ask the question, well, who doesn't? Who doesn't trust the government? Who doesn't think the system is going to deliver for them? But the important thing is then not to go to face people who are feeling economically insecure or marginalized by our society and just look at them and say, well, why don't you trust the system? Because the question answers itself. So it leads you then to action to say, how can we build a fairer economy? How can we address discrimination and racism in our society? How can we take the steps towards reconciliation? How can we address the youth mental health crisis? And then we don't have to talk about trusting, and then we'll come back and measure it when we fixed all those things, right? And I think we would be pleasantly surprised.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And our time is up. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to our discussion in the hallways and at coffee. Thank you.
Aishka, to Andrew, Senator Dasko, you've given us a lot to think about when it comes to trust, and we are now at the point when we can take a break. We have refreshments available upstairs and outside, and please continue this conversation. When we come back, we will be moving from trust to transformation. And we'll be back here in half an hour. So please enjoy the break, and then we'll be back very shortly. Merci. Et dans quelques 5 minutes, nous serons ici de nouveau pour continuer la consultation. Merci.